The case of Ronald True is unique in this series of essays on murder for two reasons. The first is the extraordinary story of its chief protagonist, whose febrile and often bizarre career towards inevitable catastrophe is charted here. The second is for the question which lies at the heart of it, concerning the extent to which a plea of insanity can mitigate the actions of the individual in the case of murder. There was one basis, and one basis alone, on which Ronald True could be saved from the scaffold, and that was by means of a successful plea of insanity. But insanity itself in British law is not sufficient, and in 1922 a person could be sentenced to death even if it was proved they were insane, unless it could be proved that at the time they committed the murder, their insanity was such that they were unable to comprehend that what they had done was wrong. And in this, the burden of proof rested entirely on the defense.
A little after 9 o'clock on the morning of the 6th of March 1922, Emily Steele arrived to do her daily cleaning job at 13A Finborough Road in Earl's Court, London. When she arrived and let herself in, she noticed a man's coat and scarf lay on the sitting-room table. This was not a surprise to her, since her mistress, Olive Young, was a 25-year-old prostitute whose real name was Gertrude Yates, and there were often clients still at the flat when she called in the morning. She went into the kitchen and made herself some breakfast, and then proceeded to tidy the sitting-room. A man came from the direction of the bedroom, and she recognized him as being a man who had stayed overnight previously. He smiled at her and said, "Don't disturb Miss Young. We were late last night, and she's in a deep sleep. I'll send a car round for her at midday." She liked the man. He was an affable gentleman, and she helped him on with his coat, and he gave her a half-crown, saying it was a tip for fetching a taxi for him at his last visit. He left the flat, and she saw him hail a taxicab at the corner of Finborough Road. It was now approximately 9:45 a.m. A few minutes afterwards, Emily Steele went and knocked on her mistress's bedroom door. Receiving no reply, she entered and went to draw the curtains. She pulled back the eiderdown bed cover and found there were two pillows placed end to end to give the appearance that there was someone in bed. The pillows were covered in blood, and there was a rolling pin in the bed which also had blood on it. She saw there were two cups, one of which lay broken on the floor, and the room had clearly been searched, as there were drawers still open. She went to a cupboard where Olive kept her jewellery, and found the jewellery box there empty. Other small amounts of money, which Olive kept to pay the gas meter and milk bill, were missing too. Now, very alarmed, she went to the bathroom and opened the door. She found in the narrow space between the wall and the bath Gertrude Yates, also known as Olive Young, lying dead on the floor. She rushed out to fetch the landlady, returned with her a few minutes later, and then called the local Chelsea police station. Inspector Rouse of B Division got on his bicycle and cycled round there immediately, arriving at about 10:20 a.m. Soon afterwards, Detective Sergeant Pierce arrived and Dr. William Stephen Lee, the divisional police surgeon. He pronounced Olive Young to be dead, and he made arrangements to conduct a post-mortem. Police found that there was blood spattered on the head of the bedstead, also on the wall, over much of the bed, and even on the ceiling. There was also a trail of blood leading from the bedroom to the bathroom, where, presumably, Olive Young had been dragged by her assailant. There was blood near the bathroom door handle and a violet dressing gown on the floor. The body of Olive Young was naked, apart from a pyjama jacket over one shoulder. Dr. Lee found the body had a temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit and, Based on the assumption that the normal human body temperature is 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit, he estimated that her time of death was between 3 and 4 hours earlier. That meant she had died between 7:30 and 8:30 that morning. A post-mortem revealed 5 major wounds favouring the right side of the head, as if she had been lying on her left side when struck. The broken cup on the floor nearby on that side of the bed suggested that she had been drinking tea unaware when she had been attacked. The nature of the wounds and the fact that the rolling pin was found in the bed with blood on it made it the probable weapon. All 5 blows had extended down to the bone and would likely have resulted in her death, although in fact they did not. She had died of strangulation. The cord of her dressing gown was found tied very tightly round her neck, and a piece of Turkish toweling had been forced down her throat all the way to her larynx with great violence. There was no sign of a struggle, and no other marks which might suggest violence against her, apart from her obvious neck and head injuries. Detective Chief Inspector Brown was on the scene by 11 a.m., and Inspector Albert Burton at 1 p.m. They made a careful inspection of the scene. The maid, Emily Steele, told police of the man who had been at the flat when she had arrived, and who had told her not to disturb Olive Young. She said she believed his name was Major True. Police also found a visiting card on the table in the sitting room. It read, Major Ronald True, 69 South Audley Street, London W1. Inquiries quickly resulted in an ex-Chief Inspector Stockley of Scotland Yard informing them that the family of Ronald True had been trying to locate him for some weeks, and he had been engaged by them as a private investigator to try to find him. He gave them some known contacts of True, and also warned them that True carried a loaded automatic pistol. An urgent manhunt across London began. Detectives were able to find the taxi driver who had picked up Ronald True at the corner of Finborough Road. He said he had driven him to Horne's Tailors and had been asked to wait for him there. He had taken True to a barber shop for a shave, and here he had been paid off. A salesman at Horne's Men's Outfitters, James Milne, told detectives that True had bought a new suit and had changed into it in the shop. He had been wearing a blood-stained suit and had told Milne that he had had a flying accident coming back from France that morning. He was limping at the time, and they had packed his old suit up for him, and he took it with him. A little while after this, police learned that a driver from a motor garage in Belgrave Square, Luigi Giuseppe Mazzola, had collected True, and also a man called Armstrong, and driven them to Croydon and a number of other places during the day. They had stopped to buy a newspaper, but True had tossed it aside, having glanced only at the front page. In Mazzola's car, detectives found a copy of the Star newspaper with an account of the dramatic murder prominent on the front page. There were 2 coats in the car also, and in the pocket of one, a pearl necklace, a platinum and diamond wristwatch, and 2 gold brooches were found. By now it was the evening of the day of the murder. Mazzola told Inspector Burton he had just driven True and his companion Armstrong to Hammersmith Palace of Varieties in West London. Inspector Burton ordered him to take himself and other detectives to this venue immediately. 4 police inspectors, Hawkins, Brown, Smith, and Burton himself, arrived at the Hammersmith Palace at 9 o'clock that evening, greatly concerned that Ronald True was armed and probably dangerous. But fortunately they discovered he and Armstrong were seated in a private box. With no one in the theatre apparently aware of the drama being played off stage, Inspector Burton went into the box and seized both of Ronald True's hands firmly and said to him, "I'm a police officer. Come out with me." Holding both his hands securely until he was outside, the detectives quickly disarmed him of his automatic pistol. Ronald True was arrested and taken to Wilton Street Police Station, and there Burton said, This morning I saw the dead body of Gertrude Yates, otherwise Young, on the bathroom floor of 13A Finborough Road, and from inquiries I find that a man answering your description stayed the night with her and left the flat at about 9:30 today. True said, "I can explain how I got possession of it. I don't want to say anything tonight. It is no use putting up a defence until the proper time." On the 7th of March, Ronald True appeared before magistrates and was remanded in custody and subsequently charged with the murder of Gertrude Yates, also known as Olive Young. Angus Ronald True was born on the 17th of June 1891 in Chorlton-on-Medlock, Lancashire, to a 16-year-old unwed Scots girl called Annabel Angus. Her stepfather and mother were innkeepers in the town of Rothes in north-east Scotland, and in this largely Presbyterian community there was nothing for it but that Annabel should be sent away after becoming pregnant by a local man, William Thomas True. He was brought up by his grandmother, who ran the Seaford Arms Hotel until her death in 1899, whereupon he was sent to a governess in Dartford, Kent. By this time his mother, Annabel Angus, was in London. She was a tall, attractive girl, spirited and ambitious, and she soon met a well-to-do young officer, Lieutenant Henry Lethbridge Alexander, and in spite of the huge social gulf existing between them, they married in 1899. He was soon afterwards posted to India, and the young couple travelled there, leaving Ronald at school and in the care of his Aunt Grace during holidays. Annabel returned from India around 1901, apparently due to ill health, and soon embarked on an affair with Arthur Reginald French, the son and heir of Lord Dufresne, scion of a wealthy aristocratic Irish Catholic family. They set up home together posing as Mr. and Mrs. Alexander, were discovered by her husband's family, and it led to a scandalous court case in which the then Lieutenant French was cited for adultery. The scandal was such that Lord Dufresne disowned his son. The couple nevertheless married in 1902, although he apparently deserted her during their honeymoon in Scotland. By 1905, the now Captain French had resigned his commission and travelled to New York, where he disappeared. He was not seen for some years, but in his absence, his substantial £2,500 per year allowance, approximately £300,000 in 2020 terms, went to his wife, Annabel French. She was now a wealthy lady, and from this time on, Ronald wanted for nothing. He boarded at Bedford School from 1903, a private school with many illustrious alumni, until he was 17 years of age. He was a poor student who seemed to have no particular aptitude for anything. There was clearly no profession suitable for the not very bright but wholly fatuous Ronald, so he was sent to New Zealand in 1908 to learn farming. It didn't work out, and in 1910 he was sent as a farm pupil to a farmer in Yorkshire. But he fared no better here, and he was soon without employment again. In 1911 he was dispatched to Bolivia as something called a sub-prefect, and was again returned to England within a year. Next he was sent to Canada, and served briefly with the North West Mounted Police, and from here he went to Mexico and then Shanghai. He was unable to settle or make any kind of mark in these places, but was sustained in his aimless wanderings by his mother, who gave him an allowance of £300 per year, about £40,000 today. His mother, constantly hoping that her son would mature with the passing years and grow beyond the adolescent mind which seemed to have entrapped him, was to be constantly disappointed. In September 1913, Ronald True's mother became Lady Annabel Dufresne. The new Lord Dufresne, having returned to England in 1914 in time for the outbreak of World War I, he and his younger brother were both killed on the same day, on the 9th of May 1915, at the Battle of Obers Bridge. By 1914, Ronald True was back in England too, the First World War now providing a new purpose for him. In spite of his apparent lack of aptitude for anything and his obvious mental instability, Ronald was accepted into the newly formed Royal Flying Corps in 1915 as a second lieutenant. His mother must have hoped this would be the making of him, but it wasn't. It was clear that Ronald had no flying ability whatever, and was lacking in the meanest of skills that might enable him to find a niche in the service. It took him 3 attempts to pass his flying certificate, whose accomplishment surprised many, but pass it he did in February 1916, and promptly had a set of flying wings made up, which were 3 times regulation size. He was regarded by his brother officers as eccentric, childish, and irresponsible, and as a terrible flyer. Soon afterwards he had a flying accident at Farnborough. It was quite a minor accident, and he was back in the air within a few days. But a second flying accident at Gosport in March 1916 left him unconscious in hospital for 2 days. A further accident resulted in injuries to his hip and a leg, which hospitalized him for several months and led to his discharge from the Royal Flying Corps as being unfit for service. By this time it was presumably quite clear to his superiors that such unfittedness was not merely limited to his physical incapacity, but to his mental incapacity also. It was also as a result of the injuries he sustained, which caused him great pain for a long period afterwards, that he became addicted to morphia. This was to be a battle he would struggle with in the ensuing years. He was also left with a limp. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1917, Ronald was employed as a test pilot at Yeovil Government Control. But his shortcomings and lack of general aptitude brought this to an end before, it might be said, it got off the ground. Then, in May 1917, he travelled to the United States, trading off his image as a broken and wounded British flying ace. It seems to have worked, and it no doubt gave him a latitude to his behaviour which would otherwise have been denied him. He met a 17-year-old aspiring actress, Frances Beamer Roberts, in New York, and they were quickly married. The status of this marriage is doubtful, because he appears to have been married at least twice previously in America in the name of E.T. Terrell and Arthur Reginald French. He had also served a prison sentence there at some time for forging money orders. Soon after, the US entered the war, and True was employed as a flying instructor at Mineola and then Houston, Texas. It was, unsurprisingly, short-lived. In June 1918 he returned to New York, and thence within a month, and via Cuba and Florida, to England with his wife. In February 1919 he and his new wife were on the move again, this time to West Africa, working as an assistant manager for the Tarkwa Mining Company. But in less than 2 months he had been suspended from this position due to his eccentricity. He was regarded as a fantasist, a teller of tall tales, as being distinctly odd. He told people there he was going to set up a transport company supplying the Gold Coast and would fly planes across the Sahara, and when the impossibility of this was pointed out to him, he said he knew of petrol supplies across the desert where he could refuel. The natives regarded him as mad, and it was partly on account of the fact that he had become a laughing-stock amongst them that he was dismissed. By August he was back in England with his wife, and now with a baby son called Ronald True, and for the next 2 years he was in and out of nursing homes being treated for morphine addiction. His increasingly erratic behaviour had persuaded his mother and aunt that there was no prospect of him holding any position of employment, and from now on he lived off the £300 allowance his mother gave him each year. His existence was aimless. He spent months in nursing homes, and as the unstable structure which formed his world collapsed, his fantasies filled the space it had once occupied. It should be said that in spite of the trail of negative impressions True left in his wake amongst the people and places he was acquainted with, He seems to have been capable of creating a good impression, too, for a limited period, or at least an impression of a somewhat eccentric man who possessed a jocular manner and fatuous good humour. But there was also a darker side to True. The police investigation of the background of Ronald True revealed a detailed and exhaustive one of minor misdemeanours, lies, and petty crime. His tall tales, which some dismissed as the exaggeration of a raconteur, began to assume a distinctly sinister turn. He began to speak of a man impersonating him, a man who was running up debts on his behalf, a man who was calling himself Ronald True. By January 1922, his family had despaired of him. He frequently threatened to kill himself. He invented stories in which he was offered employment for large amounts of money, and then, when these were inevitably discovered to be fiction, he would go out on a drugs binge lasting several days, until his wife Frances would eventually locate him, and the cycle of addiction clinics would begin all over again. His aunt, Grace Angus, said that he had written out a note which was purported to be from the Portuguese government, which offered him employment, with a penny stamp on the top, which he had scribbled over. When she told him it was nonsense, he burst into tears and said he would go and kill himself. Those who knew True in 1921 were becoming convinced he was not odd. He was insane. Then, in January 1922, Ronald True disappeared. His long-suffering wife and mother were unable to find him, and all inquiries drew a blank. He had told his wife in January he wanted nothing more to do with her. His wife and mother contacted Scotland Yard, who were unable to help. He had not committed any crime, but they put him in touch with an ex-Inspector Stockley, who now worked as a private investigator in London. Ronald was living at hotels and leaving without paying his bills. He signed bad cheques. His mother and wife were following in his trail, paying off his creditors. He seems to have known this, because he spoke darkly to his associates of a man who was impersonating him, who was running up debts that his mother was having to pay. He told people the man was armed and was going to kill him, and that he was going to kill the man first. In February, he met an out-of-work man called Armstrong, and the two became close friends. They were constantly in each other's company. Armstrong sold True his automatic pistol for £2 around 8th of February, which True told him he needed for self-protection when he sometimes had to ditch his plane in remote and hostile places when flying abroad. He kept the pistol loaded and in his pocket all the time. He told people it was in preparation for the inevitable day when that meeting would take place with the man who was impersonating him, the other Ronald True. About this time he met a woman called Mrs. Elizabeth Wilson at Murray's Club, where he was a member, and whom he attached himself to. She was uncomfortable with him, afraid of his oddness, of the revolver he showed her, of his threats to shoot her, and, on one occasion, of telling her he was hoping to meet her husband so he could shoot him. He was joking, of course, but his black humour frightened her. He told her of the other Ronald True who was going about London impersonating him, and he said that they would have to meet one day, and when that happened, there would be a how d'ye do. She was sufficiently alarmed to talk to the club management about this, and a man named Ronald True, his name spelled differently, was informed of this in the light of the threats his namesake was making. Ronald True rang Mrs. Wilson at 11 o'clock one evening to tell her that he had returned to his mother's house to find the servants gone, and on entering through a window, he had discovered his mother battered about the head. She had been taken to hospital and was to be operated on in the morning by a man named Wilson, but he said he held out little hope for her. Mrs. Wilson, naturally shocked by this news, scanned the newspapers the following day to find an account of this attack, but could find none. When she inquired further of him, he said, "I am keeping it quiet for the time being. There is going to be a big case about it." Then suddenly he stopped stalking Mrs. Wilson. She was relieved, but someone else was not, because the reason he had stopped pursuing Mrs. Wilson was that he had found a new obsession: Olive Young. Olive Young was 25 years old, born in 1897 in Warwickshire. She had left school in her mid-teens and become a salesgirl in a fur shop in London. From here she appears to have drifted into prostitution, quite successfully. She was a cut above the average street girl. In a few short years she had acquired a basement flat in Finborough Road, a maid who attended her from 9 until 2 p.m. each day, and some expensive jewellery. She also had a post office savings account balance of £161, approximately £10,000 today. In spite of his staying over at her flat on the 18th of February, Olive must have deemed this to be a mistake, because she did her best thereafter to avoid him. He rang her up each day, but to no avail, and in the days before her murder he began to turn up at the flat each evening, even twice in a day, in the hope of seeing her, but was disappointed each time. She appeared to be avoiding him, but on the 5th of March he was at last admitted. He stayed the night, it seems, and in the morning the tragedy unfolded which led to his arrest. The trial of Ronald True began at the Old Bailey on the 1st of May 1922 before Judge Henry McCarty. The Crown was represented by Sir Richard Muir and the defence by Sir Henry Curtis Bennett. The prosecution had a very strong case against Ronald True. He had been left at the murder house late on the evening of the 5th of March, and on the following morning he had been found at the house by the maid Emily Steele. Given that the windows were barred, the back door bolted and the front door locked, only Olive Young could have admitted her killer. Ronald's suit had blood on it on the morning of the murder. His overcoat had her jewellery in one of its pockets, and he had pawned both of the rings he had been wearing also. And there were other circumstances which pointed convincingly to Ronald True's guilt. He had been dropped several times in the days prior to the murder by the chauffeur Mazzola. He had spoken of violence a number of times in the weeks before the murder. He had purchased a gun and declared his intention of shooting the other Ronald True. He had developed, it seems, an unhealthy obsession with homicide and wanted to kill someone. He told Mrs. Wilson to watch the papers. He told another friend of his intention of killing the man who was threatening him, and even drew a sketch of the basement flat where he said the man lived, which was clearly a diagram of Olive Young's flat. On the evening before the murder, he had no money left. He was broke. Ronald True sat in the dock grinning at police, at witnesses and others in court. He seemed to be enjoying the attention he received enormously. At an earlier hearing he had worn a monocle with no glass in it. He placed a yellow duck on the table before him as a mascot, and also a champagne cork for some reason. The prosecution called numerous witnesses in support of the Crown case. Emily Steele, the maid, identified Major True and gave an account of his actions on the morning of the murder. Mazzola, the driver, gave evidence of having driven True to 13A Finborough Road on the evening of the murder, and on other occasions also. The taxi driver gave evidence he had collected True from the same house on the following morning, of taking him to Horn's Outfitters and thence to a barber shop. Milne, of Horn's, testified that True had blood on his suit when he arrived there, that he purchased a new one and changed into it in the shop. He also gave evidence that he had been shown the victim's jewels by True. Armstrong, his recent companion, testified to Ronald True's movements during the day before and after the murder, and to the purchase he made of the Star newspaper, to his glancing at the front page of this, and then dismissing it with the words, "Nothing in it." Mrs. Wilson testified to True's odd and frightening obsession with her, to his refusal to allow her to dance with anyone else, and the threats he had made towards herself, her husband, and to others. And Inspector Burton and other detectives and police officers gave evidence concerning the crime scene, the circumstances of True's arrest, and to the statements he had made. Sir Henry Curtis Bennet was retained at great expense to defend Ronald True against the charge of wilful murder, and his task was an unenviable one. The evidence against his client was damning, and though True pleaded not guilty, this was hardly the basis on which a sensible defence could be mounted. Throughout the trial, therefore, he was obliged to play a delicate two-handed parlour game. Throughout the duration of the prosecution case, he attempted as best he could to undermine aspects of the Crown case with the one hand, while with the other he began to lay the basis for what would, inevitably, be his chief defence, that of insanity. But he knew that this would be extremely difficult because of the rules and long series of precedents underpinning criminal responsibility in Britain. The rules governing the use of insanity as a defence in English law were laid down in the NaghtenRules of 1843. These sprang from the case of Daniel Macnaghten, who on the afternoon of the 20th of January 1843 had shot Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel's private secretary in the mistaken belief that he was the Prime Minister. Macnaghten was tried and found not guilty by reason of insanity, and the concerns over the verdict in this case led to the House of Lords formulating a set of rules as the future basis by which a defence of insanity could be judged. The NaghtenRules set a high standard for the proof of insanity because it not only placed the burden of proof on the defendant to prove their insanity, but it demanded proof that their insanity was such that they did not understand that what they had done was wrong. Thus a person could be insane, but still understand that the act they had committed was wrong in the legal sense, that it was a punishable act. In such circumstances, though they might well be insane, they would still be guilty of wilful murder and subject to the full penalty of the law. It was on this basis and this basis alone that Sir Henry Curtis Bennet could save Ronald True from the gallows. The prosecution expected this defence. Sir Richard Muir had clearly done a great deal of research into the judgments governing insanity defences at trials since the Macnaghten case and subsequent appeal rulings. Curtis Bennet called a succession of witnesses to prove that Ronald True was insane, and that his delusions were such that he did not comprehend that what he did was wrong. True's aunt, Grace Angus, was called and gave an account of Ronald's oddness as a child, of his cruelty to animals, and of his burying his rabbits with their heads exposed, so he could see them, of mistreating his pony, and at the age of 14, when told his mother was seriously ill, had simply said, "Oh well, if she dies all her property will be mine, and I'll give you her 2 best rings straight away." Associates from True's past were called to give accounts of his bizarre behaviour, his boastfulness, and fantastical tales, to his fixing a tutor to his wheelchair when in hospital, and to his carrying children's toys around with him. An acquaintance from the Gold Coast and Tarquin Mining Company spoke of the natives there regarding him as being not right in the head. Doctors and nurses and others from various clinics and hospitals and institutions at which he had been treated for addiction to morphine testified that he was regarded as insane. 2 doctors who had watched him while on remand at Brixton Prison declared that True was, without a doubt, insane, and 2 specialists brought in from Bethlehem Insane Asylum in London both averred that Ronald True was certifiably insane. Ronald True was not placed in the witness box. The prospect of that did not seem to be regarded with favour by anyone involved. It was upon the point of whether Ronald True's insanity was sufficient to prevent him from comprehending that the nature of his actions in murdering Olive Young were wrong and punishable by law. Sir Richard Muir argued that placing 2 pillows in the bed to give the impression that there was someone in it was an act of concealment, that it was the act of a man who knew he had done wrong and wished to evade the consequences of his action. He also pointed out that when buying a new suit the morning of the murder, Ronald True had told James Milne, the salesman, that the bloodstains were from a flying accident, and that this was clearly an attempt at concealment also. But Sir Henry Curtis Bennet argued that the attempts he had made at such evasion were so risibly inadequate, so utterly ineffective, that they could hardly be thought to constitute serious acts of evasion, and that consequently they did not amount to an understanding on his part of the gravity of the crime he had committed. When Judge McHardy summed up, he made clear that the jury had 3 possible verdicts available to them: guilty of wilful murder, guilty but not responsible by reason of insanity, and not guilty. But if the verdict of guilty but not responsible by reason of insanity was to be given, then it would be necessary for them to be satisfied that the defendant was insane to a degree that he did not know that what he had done was wrong. The jury were out for 1 hour, and when they returned, the verdict was given to the clerk of the court. Ronald True was guilty of wilful murder. Judge McHardy donned the black cap, and Ronald True was sentenced to death. He was removed to Pentonville Prison to await execution on what would be his 31st birthday, the 16th of June, 1922. An appeal was heard and dismissed on the 24th of May. True was not, it seems, unduly troubled by the prospect of his impending execution, as the following letter to a friend clearly shows. Dear Sims, many thanks for your kind letter. If I may say so, life is so short. Mine will probably not exceed another 14 days. It's unfortunate that I shall probably cash in my chips just prior to my birthday, i.e. 16th of June, but I'm considering petitioning the King to extend the period to June the 17th. Anyway, my motto has always been Kismet. It was awfully good of you to take the trouble you did over my case, and I can assure you I am grateful for all that you did. Naturally, there's no news to tell you, as owing to circumstances over which I have no control, I don't get much outside information. It may interest you to know that the winner of the Derby is included in this little lot: Re-Echo, Tamar, Diligence, and Lord of Burleigh, and with a little judicious management you should be able to have them running for you at only a small investment and still be well covered. Remember, Sims, keep smiling no matter what happens. Give my kindest regards to your wife, and again thanking you also. Cheerio, old nut. Yours sincerely, Ronald True. In early June 1922, just 2 weeks before his execution, the Home Secretary Edward Short called for reports on Ronald True's state of mind. 3 leading doctors led the inquiry into Ronald True's mental condition and declared that he was certifiably insane. As a result of this, on the 8th of June 1922, the sentence of death was respited, and Ronald True was ordered to be detained at His Majesty's pleasure at the Broadmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane. He was taken at 9:30 a.m. the following morning from Pentonville Prison to Broadmoor by train and taxicab. He was in high spirits. A ticket collector recognized him at the station. "Isn't that True?" he inquired of True's escorts. "No, he's balmy," replied one of the warders. True, delighted to be recognized, said, "Great chap, what?" The intervention of the Home Secretary in this matter and his decision to grant clemency in the case of Ronald True caused considerable controversy. The judgment of the jury had been that, according to the application of the NaghtenRules and the directions given, Ronald True understood that what he had done was punishable by law. In effect, regardless of whether or not he was insane, he understood the nature and quality of his actions to the extent that he defied the instruction of the law. Angus Ronald True was insane. That he had periods of lucidity and was able to function at some level in society does not affect that judgment. His illness was almost certainly affected by morphine addiction, and by the accidents he had suffered in the Royal Flying Corps. But in February 1922 he was certifiably insane and had become dangerous. His family knew it, the prison doctors knew it, and most people who met him knew it. But there is also little doubt that Ronald True knew what he did was wrong and punishable in law. The attempts he made at concealment of his actions indicate that, and the inadequacy of such concealment hardly affects that judgment, since it would plainly be absurd to use as a measure of a person's sanity the efficacy of their attempts at concealment. But with that said, that True knew what he was doing to some degree was wrong, it has to be considered. What was the quality of that knowledge, the extent of his understanding? His comprehension of the act was in direct proportion to the measures he took to conceal the matter. Almost negligible. By the strict application of the NaghtenRules, as they stood in 1922 by precedent and by application, Ronald True was guilty of wilful murder. The defence of insanity was insufficient, and the jury was correct in its verdict, and the appeal court correct in its refusal of the appeal. But it was clear that the use of the NaghtenRules in such cases required updating to suit the complexity of cases and advances in medical knowledge which was apparent in the trial. As it was, Edward Short, the Home Secretary, was also correct in applying clemency in this case. In fact, he had no choice in the matter, which was not widely appreciated at the time. This was because, under Section 2 of the Trial of Lunatics Act 1883, the Home Secretary was required by law to appoint medical men to assess the condemned man if insanity was in question, because it was laid down by statute that though an insane person could be sentenced to death, he could not be hanged. Short, therefore, had no choice in the matter, and when the inquiry certified True to be insane, he had no choice but to respite the sentence of death. It was Olive Young's misfortune that her erring star met that of Ronald True's on the night of the 5th of March 1922. Had it not done so, it certainly would have been Mrs. Wilson or her husband or his long-suffering wife or mother, not from malice, but prompted by a disordered mind which had confused locations and people and even his personal needs in a distorted idea which had settled upon a determination to murder someone soon. He had become obsessed with killing someone, from delusional paranoia, from the deterioration of his mental faculties due to physical injury, to morphine addiction, out of personal frustration, and from a sense of his own worthlessness. That huge ego which conceived of himself, quite genuinely, as the best billiards player, the best golfer, the best pilot, when in fact he was none of these, and performed at a very low level in all things. That distorted view of his own capabilities jarred with everyone he met, and it didn't match his own performance in any way. He told tales of his taking on 5 German planes during the war, when in fact he had seen no service, never left England, and succeeded only in crashing 3 planes before being discharged from the Royal Flying Corps. He told people he had once saved a train full of passengers on the west coast of the US from robbers, when he had shot one of the men and knocked the other down with his fist. He told various people that he had once fought a German over a land claim in America, fought him all day and at last killed him, and then he had written out the land claim in the German's blood. He constantly invented jobs which matched his ego, with the Portuguese government for which he drew up a ludicrous contract with a penny stamp affixed, and when brought to earth by the intrusion of reality that he had failed at everything that he had attempted to do, he became frustrated, burst into tears, was conscious in some strange way of the division in himself, the marvellous and successful Ronald True who could do anything, and the one who was undermining him at every point of his life. There would, as he put it so memorably to Mrs. Wilson, be a how d'ye do when they met. Olive Young, like Mrs. Wilson and so many others, thought him insane and dangerous, because he was. When she rejected him repeatedly and he could not reach her by phone or by visiting her flat at night, that frustration became personified in the form of Olive Young. On the morning of the 6th of March 1922, Ronald True woke to a brutal reality. He was unemployed, broke, and in the company of a prostitute who was completely disinterested in him. The contract he had made with life was not worth the penny stamp he had affixed to it and scribbled over. He got up and fetched the newspaper. He made them cups of tea. Olive, oblivious, wanted this strange man gone. He certainly couldn't pay her, and his admission of this would only complete his humiliation. And here were her jewels lying about her flat. As she drank her tea, he rummaged in the kitchen drawer and brought back a rolling pin, which he concealed from her. He came up to her silently, smiling even, that inane, fatuous grin he wore so often, and he hit her. The cup tipped from her hand to the floor, and she collapsed on the bed. And as she did so, and as the blood oozed from her wound, he hit her 4 more times in rapid succession. He rammed a piece of towel into her mouth with great violence and sudden anger, and pulling the cord from her dressing gown, strangled her. Then he dragged her body to the bathroom. It is difficult to know exactly what his thought process was at this moment. It's difficult, too, to ascribe all his actions of concealment to rational thought. There is obviously an element of it there, but as in all things with Ronald True, it is of low quality, has many blanks in it, is incomplete. He wasn't really firing on all cylinders. He made cursory efforts at concealment, the pillows in the bed, the closed door, and of course he asked the maid not to disturb her mistress, leaving unhurriedly, even giving her a half-crown of her dead mistress's money. He even left his visiting card. He had no hope whatever of escape except in the fantastic world occupied by Ronald True. Because Ronald True was a child trapped in a man's body, without cognitive or emotional intelligence to inform his actions, or the means of grasping the world outside himself. Ronald True spent the rest of his life in Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane. He seems to have been popular there, and played a major role in its theatre society. He was housed in the gentlemen's ward there, was known affectionately as Ronnie by staff and inmates alike. There were many attempts made over the years by his mother to obtain his release, but they all failed. She sent him 35 shillings allowance per week, and he lived very well there. He was allowed a garden where he cultivated beautiful roses, and was often to be seen strolling up and down the terrace with his mother during her regular visits to him. It seems that in Broadmoor Asylum, Ronald True had found his niche at last. On New Year's Day 1951, he collapsed with chest pains, and he died of a heart attack 6 days later, on the 7th of January 1951. He was 59 years old.